Not because I'm telling you to, but because something in you already paused before I said that. You felt something shift when this video started, something quiet and certain, like a door opening in a room you forgot existed inside you. I want to talk to you about a specific moment. A moment most people never discuss publicly because they don't know how to name it without sounding either arrogant or unhinged. The moment you told someone your truth, your real truth, the deep, unreasonable, certain truth you carry, and watched their face change. Not with curiosity, not with wonder, with something that looked almost like offense. And in that split second, you had two simultaneous thoughts that seemed to contradict each other. The first thought was, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've been living inside my own head too long. Maybe I've convinced myself of something that isn't real. Maybe I'm the problem. The second thought, quieter, steadier, almost embarrassing to admit, was, no, I'm not wrong. They just can't go where I'm going. And the fact that you had both of those thoughts at the same time, that you felt the doubt and the certainty simultaneously, that is the exact thing I need to talk to you about today. Because that specific tension between doubting yourself and knowing yourself is not a flaw in you. It is the signature of a particular kind of mind, a particular kind of awareness. And if you've lived with that tension your entire life, this video might be the first time someone explains it to you in a way that doesn't feel like flattery and doesn't feel like pathology. Stay with me for the full length of this, because the thing I'm building toward in the last section is the part that will actually change something in how you move through the world, not theoretically, but practically, starting today. Why some people cannot handle certain kinds of truth. Let's start with something uncomfortable that we're going to make comfortable. When I say your truth, I don't mean your opinions. I don't mean your preferences or your political positions or your favorite way to spend a Sunday. I mean the deeper thing. The pattern you see that other people insist isn't there. The knowing you carry about a situation that you couldn't fully justify with logic, but that turned out to be entirely correct. The thing you said in a room that landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples going out, everyone pretending they didn't notice. There is a word in psychology called epistemic discomfort. It describes the specific unease a person feels when encountering information that doesn't fit their existing framework. Not information that's wrong, information that requires them to expand, to accommodate something they hadn't previously made room for. Most people respond to epistemic discomfort by rejecting the source. It's easier to decide that the person saying the uncomfortable thing is wrong or naive or problematic than to sit with the discomfort long enough to let it do its work. This is not a character flaw in those people. It's a survival mechanism. The human brain is an efficiency engine. It builds models of the world and then defends those models because rebuilding them is energetically expensive. A challenge to the model doesn't feel like information. It feels like a threat. Now here is what I need you to actually understand, not just intellectually nod at, but genuinely absorb. When someone cannot handle your truth, that is information about their model, not about your truth. This sounds simple. It is not simple to live, because the people who couldn't handle your truth were often people you loved. People whose opinion of you mattered enormously. A parent, a partner, a best friend you'd had since childhood, a mentor you respected, a community you'd belonged to for years. And when those specific people looked at you with that specific expression, the one that said, "I don't recognize you right now, and I'm not sure I want to," something in you absorbed that as evidence that you should be smaller. We're going to talk about why that happened, what it actually means, and why the discomfort you feel about it is not a wound to heal, but a compass to follow. The architecture of the chosen one's narrative. and why most versions of it are getting it wrong, I want to address something directly before we go deeper. If you've spent time in spiritual, self-development, or awakening communities online, you've encountered a version of the Chosen One's narrative before. And I want to be honest with you about both what's true in it and what's being manipulated. The true part: some people do develop through a combination of temperament, experience, and deliberate attention, a capacity for perception that is genuinely less common. The capacity to see patterns early, to feel the emotional undercurrent of a room without being told what it is, to ask questions that cut through the surface of things, to sit with uncertainty longer than most people can tolerate, and to arrive at insight that more comfortable people would have fled before reaching. This is real. This is not supernatural. It is the product of a specific kind of development, often forged in specific kinds of difficulty. It is also genuinely alienating, because the world is mostly organized around the average, and the average doesn't always have room for what you're carrying. The manipulated part: a lot of content in this space takes that real experience and wraps it in fabricated urgency, artificial scarcity, and false authority entities. Portals, 7 two-hour windows, DNA that makes you cosmically special, not because those things serve you, but because fear and flattery are the two most reliable tools for separating a person from their discernment and their money. The version I want to offer you today has none of those mechanisms in it. No portal that closes in 3 days, no membership that unlocks your potential, no cosmic entity who selected you from the multitude, no declaration you need to make out loud to seal your fate. Just an honest conversation about what it actually means to carry truth that other people aren't ready for, and how to do it without losing yourself in the process. The 3 things that happen when you tell a deep truth to the wrong person. Let me describe a sequence you've probably experienced enough times to recognize immediately. The first thing that happens is the pause. You say the thing, the real thing. Maybe you name the dynamic in the relationship that everyone is dancing around. Maybe you share the perspective that contradicts what the room has agreed to believe. Maybe you describe what you experienced in terms that are too precise and too unfiltered and too honest. And there is a pause. A beat of silence that feels slightly longer than normal pauses. The second thing that happens is the reframe. The other person doesn't engage with what you said. They engage with a version of it that is more manageable for them. They flatten it, or they pathologize it, or they make it about your personality rather than the content of what you observed. You always do this. You're being too sensitive. Not everything has to be so deep. Why do you have to make everything complicated? Notice what happened. You offered information. They offered you a diagnosis. The third thing that happens is the self-audit. And this is the one that does the most damage over time. You go home or they leave, and you replay the conversation, and you start to wonder if they're right. Not because the evidence supports it, but because the repetition of the diagnosis over time creates something that feels like memory. You start to collect moments where maybe you were too intense. Maybe you did make things complicated. Maybe there is something fundamentally off about the way you engage with reality. And slowly, quietly, without anyone forcing you, you start to trim yourself. You start to leave the deepest observations unspoken. You develop a filtered version of yourself for certain company, a lighter, more palatable, less threatening version, and you call that growth or maturity or being considerate of others. But there is something else you could call it. You could call it the cost of belonging in rooms that were never built for your full size. Why? That too much thing is not the problem they made it sound like. Here is a reframe I want you to sit with. The people who found you too much were not encountering a defect. They were encountering a demand. Your presence, at full depth, makes a demand on people. the demand to be present rather than comfortable, the demand to engage rather than perform, the demand to examine rather than assume, to feel rather than manage, to question rather than confirm. That demand is not cruelty. It's not arrogance. It's not even intentional most of the time. It's just what happens when a person who has done a certain amount of inner work enters a space with people who haven't. Think of it like altitude. If you've been living at a high elevation for a long time, your lungs have adapted. You can breathe easily in thin air. When someone from sea level visits you, they struggle. Not because they're weak, because they haven't made that adaptation yet. And you can't give them your lung capacity. They have to earn it through their own exposure. Your truth operates the same way. Some people have built the internal capacity to receive it, to sit with a perspective that disrupts their model and stay curious rather than defensive, to encounter a depth of feeling or observation that exceeds their current framework and respond with genuine interest rather than anxious deflection. Most people, at any given time, haven't. Not because they're lesser, because they haven't been through what you've been through, or developed what you've developed, or spent the particular quality of time alone with themselves that builds the kind of tolerance for truth that your truth requires. This is not a judgment. It is a sorting function. And when you understand it as a sorting function rather than a rejection, everything shifts. What the moment of rejection was actually sorting for. Let me tell you what was actually happening in all those moments when someone couldn't handle your truth. The moment wasn't failing. The moment was working perfectly. Every time you told your truth and someone couldn't receive it, you were receiving information, clear, unambiguous, actionable information about the depth of connection that was available in that particular relationship at that particular time. Not whether the person was good or bad, not whether you were too much or too little, but specifically what was available. And this is the part that most people in this space don't say clearly enough, so I want to say it plainly. You cannot build a deep life with people who require you to stay shallow, not because shallow people are the enemy, but because you cannot sustain the constant compression. The daily work of making yourself smaller is exhausting in a way that's almost invisible. You don't feel the weight of it until the day you're finally, unexpectedly, around someone who can handle all of you, and you notice how much easier it is to breathe. Some of you are experiencing that contrast for the first time right now, in certain relationships or spaces you've recently entered. And the contrast is disorienting because you didn't realize how much energy you were spending on compression until you stopped. That's what the sorting was for. Not to isolate you, to navigate you toward the rooms where your full size is not a problem to be managed, but a resource that gets used. The part nobody talks about, what it costs to be right before others are ready. There is a specific flavor of loneliness that belongs to this experience, and I want to name it precisely because imprecise language is part of why it's so hard to move through. It's not the loneliness of being unknown, it's the loneliness of being known and still not reached. It's the particular pain of having said something true and having it dismissed, and then watching months or years later as the same person arrives at the same truth on their own and presents it as a discovery, without any awareness that you said it first, without any acknowledgement of the conversation where you tried. That experience has a way of teaching a very specific lesson if you let it teach the wrong one. The lesson it teaches, if you're not careful, is stop saying true things early. Wait until the room is ready. Compress yourself to match the current capacity of whoever you're with. And I understand why that lesson feels protective. It is protective in the short term. You get rejected less. You create less friction. You belong more easily to more spaces. But the cost is the exact thing you were built to offer. your clearest, most precise, most fully formed perception, the thing that is genuinely rare and genuinely needed, goes unspoken because you learned that speaking it cost too much. That is the actual tragedy of the chosen one's narrative. Not that the chosen ones get rejected, but that enough rejection teaches them to stop choosing. The 3 people you need in your life right now. Let's get practical, because this is the part that actually changes something. If you've spent a significant portion of your life compressing your truth to fit available relationships, the work is not self-acceptance in the abstract. The work is specific. It's relational, and it starts with identifying 3 kinds of people who need to be in your actual life, not as a concept, but as real presences. The first is what I call a full capacity witness. This is someone who can receive your most developed thinking without flinching, without deflecting into diagnosis, and without needing you to slow down to protect their comfort. They don't have to agree with you. In fact, the best full capacity witnesses push back hard, but they push back on the content, not on your right to have it. They engage with your actual ideas rather than managing your emotional state or theirs. If you don't have one of these people, that is the single most important gap to close. Not through a course or a protocol or a 2-1-day practice. By going to the spaces, physical, virtual, or otherwise, where people who have done comparable inner work are actually gathered and staying long enough to be known. The second is what I call a productive challenger. This is different from a full capacity witness. A productive challenger is someone who represents a genuinely different framework, not a smaller framework, a different one who can meet you at your level and offer real resistance, whose disagreement makes your thinking sharper rather than making you smaller. The reason this matters is that a life spent only among people who can fully receive your truth becomes an echo chamber of a different kind. You need someone whose full capacity is oriented differently than yours, who will tell you where your pattern recognition is becoming pattern imposition, where your depth is tipping into density, where your certainty is outrunning your evidence. That person is not your enemy. They are done right, one of the most valuable relationships in your life. The third is someone you are ahead of, who you choose to walk with anyway. This is the one the chosen one's narrative most often leaves out, because it's not flattering to the specialness framework. If you only seek people who are at or above your current level, you become untethered from the majority of human experience. You lose the specific kind of wisdom that comes from being useful to someone who is where you used to be, from translating what you know into language accessible to someone who hasn't made the journey yet, from being patient in the way you needed someone to be patient with you once. The people who couldn't handle your truth at full volume are not simply obstacles to your growth. Some of them, approached differently, not with compression, but with translation, become the relationship where your capacity for depth actually gets used most fully. The real reason they couldn't handle it. And what to do with that. I want to close with the thing I think is actually most important to carry out of this video. The reason most people couldn't handle your truth is not that your truth was wrong. It's not that you were too much. It's not even primarily about them. It's that truth, genuinely delivered, asks something of the person receiving it. It asks them to respond from their deepest available honesty rather than their most comfortable habit. And for most people, in most moments, that ask arrives at the exact wrong time when they're tired, or defended, or already stretched, or simply haven't built the capacity yet. This means that the truth you carry is not the problem. The delivery mechanism, the timing, and the selection of who receives it, those are the variables you actually have influence over. You don't have to compress yourself to belong, but you do have to develop the discernment to know which rooms can hold you when the moment is right, and how to calibrate the delivery without losing the depth. That is the actual craft, not performing smallness, not demanding that every room rise to meet you immediately, but developing the fluency to know when full volume serves the moment and when it doesn't, and making that choice from wisdom rather than from the old fear of being too much. The moment they couldn't handle your truth was not the end of your truth. It was the beginning of your education in how to carry it. And if you're here, watching this, sitting with this, you're already further in that education than you probably give yourself credit for. The people who couldn't handle it weren't the final verdict on what you carry. They were, in the most useful possible reading, the exact friction that sharpened the edge of it. Carry it, calibrate it, find the rooms that were built for it, and stop making yourself smaller for rooms that weren't. If this landed for you, share it with someone who needed to hear it, not because it seals anything or opens a portal, just because that's what we do with things that are true.